good evening and welcome. Settle in the way that feels most comfortable. Let your shoulders drop, let your jaw unclench, and allow your breathing to slow until it feels easy and unforced. You don't need to achieve anything right now. You only need to be here, listening, resting, and letting the day fade gently into the background. If your thoughts wander, that's fine. Just let them pass like clouds and come back to the sounds and images of a warm, honeyed place where everything moves in calm, steady rhythm. The late summer sun was already leaning west when the guest arrived at the edge of the small apiary. The path was simple, packed earth, a few flat stones, and grass that had been pressed down by many quiet walks. Yet it felt like an intentional entryway, a threshold between busy human time and the slower time kept by fields, insects, and warm wood. A light breeze moved through the hedge and carried the scent of dried clover and something faintly sweet, like fruit warmed on a windowsill. Somewhere close by, a sparrow scolded the air for a moment, then fell silent, as if remembering this was a place for softer voices. The beekeeper waited near the gate, not in a hurry, hands relaxed at his sides. He didn't speak immediately, and the pause felt kind, as if he were giving the guest a moment to arrive fully, not only in body, but in attention. Behind him, the hives sat in neat rows on low stands, pale boxes with roofs that caught the sun and held it in a muted glow. The air around them held a constant sound, an even, velvety hum that rose and fell in tiny waves, like distant wind moving through tall grass. They greeted each other in a low voice, more of a courtesy than a necessity, because the place itself seemed to invite quiet. The guest noticed how the beekeeper moved. No sudden gestures, no sharp turns of the head, no impatience in the way he shifted his weight. It was the posture of someone who had learned that calm is not only an emotion, but a tool, a way of fitting into the environment without causing ripples. Even the bees, drifting in gentle arcs between hive entrances and flowers, looked less like frantic dots and more like pieces of a living pattern. The beekeeper offered a veil and a light jacket, and the guest accepted, appreciating the simple ritual. The fabric smelled faintly of smoke and sun-dried cotton, the kind of smell that suggests many afternoons spent outdoors. As the guest pulled the veil down, the world softened slightly, not in clarity, but in feeling, as if a thin curtain had been drawn between ordinary concerns and this slower scene. The hum of the apiary became a steady background, neither loud nor quiet, simply present, an ongoing note that the mind could lean against. They walked between the hives, and the guest kept their steps careful, placing each foot as though the ground deserved respect. Small plants grew in the gaps, time near one stand, a cluster of calendula near another, and a few late-blooming wildflowers that had escaped any neat plan and were allowed to remain. Bees floated over them, landing, lifting, turning in midair with patient confidence. In the warm light, wings flashed like thin glass, and every movement seemed guided by purpose rather than urgency. The beekeeper paused beside a hive whose entrance was busy but not chaotic. Bees came and went in a measured flow, some arriving with pollen packed on their legs like tiny saddlebags of gold and rust. Others emerged and lifted away into the field, quickly becoming indistinguishable from the bright air. The guest watched long enough to see that it wasn't random. There were intervals, patterns, a kind of quiet order that didn't need a conductor because it had been practiced for thousands of summers. From a pocket, the beekeeper drew a smoker, not yet lit, and held it as one might hold a teapot before pouring calmly, thoughtfully. He explained in a soft voice that smoke was not a weapon and not a trick, but a gentle suggestion, a way to keep the colony settled while the hive was opened. The guest nodded and realized they were already breathing more slowly, syncing with the pace of this work. The sun warmed the back of their neck through the veil, and the breeze slipped in from the side, cool enough to feel refreshing without bringing a chill. When the smoker was lit, it did not billow or roar. It simply exhaled thin ribbons of pale smoke that smelled of dried herbs and smoldering wood. The scent mixed with the air's sweetness and created something comforting, like a memory of a campfire far away from any noise. The beekeeper puffed a little at the entrance and waited, not because he had to, but because waiting was part of the craft. The bees' hum stayed steady, and the guest understood that calm does not always sound like silence. Sometimes it sounds like a continuous, soft vibration that holds everything together. The lid lifted with a gentle, careful motion, and the hive's inner warmth rose like bread heat from an oven. guest caught the first clear note of wax, clean, golden, slightly floral, and then the fuller scent of honey, not sharp, but round and deep, as if the sunlight itself had been stored and mellowed. Beneath those scents was the woody smell of the boxes and frames, the grounded, honest fragrance of dry timber. The beekeeper set the lid down without a thud, as though even the wood appreciated being handled with care. Inside, the frames sat in tidy alignment, each one a narrow city block built of wax and devotion. Bees moved across the comb in calm streams, touching antennae, stepping aside for one another, disappearing into the cells and emerging again. The guest expected frantic activity, but what they saw was composed, a crowd, yes, yet not a crush. It resembled a well-run marketplace at the end of a warm day, where everyone knows where to go and nothing needs to be shouted. The beekeeper loosened the first frame with a hive tool, the metal making a quiet, satisfying sound against wood, and propolis more of a gentle click than a scrape. He lifted slowly, letting the bees adjust, letting gravity do its work without forcing anything. The frame emerged heavy with life, bees covering the surface like a living cloth, and beneath them the pattern of comb, capped cells, and open spaces. The guest felt the urge to lean closer, not out of thrill, but out of reverence, the way one leans toward a sleeping child or a delicate flower. The hum around them changed slightly, not in volume, but in texture, as if the air had become finer. Individual bees buzzed past the veil, and the sound near the ears became a soft, layered whisper, many tiny wings making one continuous tone. It wasn't aggressive. It was simply the sound of presence, the sound of work. The guest noticed that this constant background did something gentle to the mind, smoothing sharp thoughts into rounded ones, turning the inner noise down without needing to be told. The beekeeper held the frame angled so the light could slip into the cells, and the guest saw the subtle glisten in some of them. There were places where nectar shone like clear syrup, places where honey had thickened into amber, and places capped with pale wax like sealed letters. The bees moved across these areas with steady precision, their legs dusted with pollen, their bodies warm with the day's heat. The guest could almost feel the temperature of the hive through the air, alive, regulated, balanced, as if the colony carried its own climate. With a slow motion, the beekeeper shifted the frame to one side and set it in a temporary holder. He didn't hurry, and he didn't linger unnecessarily. He moved with a pace that said, "Nothing here must be rushed." The guest noticed the beekeeper's hands, strong enough to lift, gentle enough to avoid crushing even a single insect. It was a kind of skill that didn't advertise itself, the kind that looks simple only because it has been practiced with patience. As the frames were inspected one by one, the guest began to see the hive as a whole, like a breathing instrument. Each part had a function: the brood area like a nursery, the honey stores like a pantry, the pollen like jars of color and protein, the bees like caretakers and gatherers and builders, all at once. The beekeeper pointed out the different patterns: the tidy arcs of capped brood, the scattered cells of pollen, the broader sealed sections where honey waited, thick and safe. The guest listened, and the information didn't feel like a lecture. It felt like being introduced to neighbors. In one frame, the guest caught sight of a bee that moved with an unhurried assurance, surrounded by a small retinue. The beekeeper leaned in, then eased back, and murmured that it was the queen. The guest didn't feel excitement in the sharp sense. Instead, they felt a gentle awe, like seeing a rare bird resting on a branch, not performing, simply existing. The queen continued on, placing eggs with a calm repetition that had the steadiness of a heartbeat. The beekeeper returned the frame slowly, guiding it into place so the bees had time to step aside. There was no jolt, no clatter, just a soft settling of wood into wood, as if the hive itself sighed and accepted the piece back into its structure. The guest realized that this was what harmony looked like. Not perfection, not stillness, but many small adjustments made continuously, without anger or panic. Outside the hive, the breeze lifted again, and a warm leaf brushed against the guest's sleeve like a quiet reassurance. They moved to the next hive, and the path between the stands felt like a corridor in a sunlit garden. The grass here was short, and tiny shadows of bees flickered over it, appearing and disappearing like brief thoughts. Somewhere in the field, a cricket began its late afternoon song, thin and persistent. The hum of the apiary remained the main note, and the cricket's sound wove into it, making the whole scene feel like layered music with no conductor and no end. the second hive, the beekeeper repeated the same calm sequence. A touch of smoke, a pause, the lid lifted, the inner cover removed. The guest appreciated the repetition. It made the work feel safe and predictable, like a familiar routine before bed. The smell of wax rose again, and now the guest could distinguish its subtle variations. Some wax smelled fresh and light, some darker and richer, as if it carried the memory of many seasons. Honey, too, had layers. A bright sweetness, a deeper floral note, and a hint of something earthy that could only come from the plants beyond the hedge. As frames were lifted, the guest noticed how the bees responded. They did not scatter, they shifted. They did not attack, they investigated. A few bumped gently against the veil, then drifted away as if satisfied with the answer to a question. The guest's breathing remained slow, and that slowness felt like a shared agreement with the hive. We will not startle each other. We will move carefully in the same warm air. The beekeeper made a small adjustment, sliding 2 frames slightly apart to check spacing, then easing them back together. The motion was subtle, yet it mattered, like adjusting a book on a shelf so it sits straight. He explained that the bees build best when given the right distances, neither too tight nor too wide, and that much of beekeeping is simply respecting those preferences. The guest found that idea soothing. That care can be a matter of honoring what something already knows about itself. In a corner of the hive, the beekeeper pointed out burr comb, small, irregular bits of wax built where space allowed. He removed it with the hive tool, not aggressively, but cleanly, and set it into a container. The guest saw honey gleaming in it, and the smell intensified, filling the veil with warmth. For a moment, the sweetness felt almost tangible, like a soft blanket laid over the senses. The beekeeper offered the guest a tiny taste, no more than a fingertip's worth, and the guest accepted with gratitude. The honey was warm from the hive, thicker than anything from a store, and it carried the field inside it. Flowers, sun, a hint of herbs. It wasn't only sweet, it was rounded and complex, like a story told slowly. As the honey dissolved, the guest felt an unexpected calm, as if their body understood the message. Summer has been gathered and saved. There is enough. They closed the second hive with the same careful attention, returning each layer in order. The lid settled without a slam, and the bees continued their traffic at the entrance, as though the brief opening had been no more disruptive than a passing cloud. The guest watched them for a long moment, bees arriving low and steady, bees leaving with purpose, guards near the entrance turning slightly as if scanning the air. Nothing felt forced. It felt like a community that knows its roles and trusts the rhythm of the day. Beekeeper led the way to the far end of the apiary, where the light was softer and the shadows longer. Here, the hives faced slightly differently, and the bees' flight paths made gentle arcs that caught the sun at a different angle. The guest could see the field beyond, a patchwork of greens, the pale heads of grasses, and the last bright spots of summer flowers. A faint shimmer rose from the warm ground, and the air carried the quiet heat of late afternoon, the kind that doesn't press down, but simply surrounds. They stopped for a short rest, not because they were tired, but because pausing was part of the experience. The beekeeper sat on a low stool, and the guest sat on a flat stone that still held warmth from the sun. Together they listened. The bee's hum was steady, and within it, the guest began to hear gentle variations, moments when the sound thickened near one hive, thinned near another, a soft crescendo when a group returned at once, then a settling again. It was like listening to rain on a roof, always the same, always different. The guest noticed other small sounds too. Leaves ticked lightly against each other as the breeze passed, making a whispering that felt like someone turning pages. A distant dog barked once, then the sound was swallowed by space. The beekeeper's breath was slow, and the guest matched it without trying, the way people match the pace of a friend when walking together. In that shared quiet, the guest felt the mind begin to unclench, releasing thoughts that had been held too tightly all day. When they resumed, the beekeeper chose a hive that needed a simple adjustment. He explained that the colony was strong and that the honey flow had been generous, so he would add space, another box, carefully placed, so the bees could continue storing without feeling crowded. The guest watched him lift the empty box, its wood pale and clean, and set it down as though placing a basket on a table. Nothing was forced, everything was aligned. Even the physical effort looked calm, because it was done with familiarity and respect. The guest helped by holding the lid for a moment, keeping it steady and clean. Through the veil, the guest guest could see their own hands moving slowly, and they felt a quiet satisfaction in being useful without intruding. Bees flew past, unconcerned, the air around them full of living motion that did not demand attention. The beekeeper set the new box in place, checked the fit, and returned the lid. The hive stood a little taller now, like a home that had gained a new room. As they stepped back, the guest noticed how quickly the hive's life absorbed the change. Bees resumed their usual movement at the entrance, and the hum settled into its constant tone, as if the colony had made a tiny note in its internal records and moved on. The guest found comfort in that adaptability. Nature did not resist every change. It responded to change with practical grace, provided the change was offered gently. The sun continued lowering, and the light turned honey-colored, as if the air itself had been sweetened. The guest looked at the hives and saw them not as boxes, but as vessels of relationship, between bees and flowers, between weather and wax, between the season's abundance and the coming months. The beekeeper spoke quietly about winter stores, about leaving enough honey for the colony, about taking only what is truly surplus. The words were simple, but they carried a moral softness. You can participate without taking too much. They walked along the line one last time, checking that each lid sat properly, that each entrance was clear. The guest noticed how the beekeeper's eyes moved, quick enough to be efficient, gentle enough to miss nothing. He brushed a bit of grass away from one stand, straightened a small stone, and paused to watch a bee struggling briefly with a burr of plant fiber. With a careful fingertip, he lifted the fiber away, and the bee resumed its flight as though nothing had happened. Few bees drifted near the guest's veil, curious, and the guest stayed still. The hum near the face became a soft vibration, and instead of feeling threatened, the guest felt included, as if allowed to stand in the edge of the bee's world for a moment. The beekeeper said something about calm hands and calm breath, and the guest realized that the advice was not only for bees. Calm was a way of moving through any crowded day, any busy thought, any uncertain moment. Slow down, soften, and become less of a disturbance. Near the end of the path, there was a small table with a jar of honey and a block of beeswax, golden and matte. The guest leaned closer and inhaled. Beeswax smelled like clean warmth. Sunlight filtered through wood, a gentle sweetness without sugar, a hint of flowers carried as memory. The honey jar caught the light, and inside it, the amber seemed to glow from its own center. The guest felt a quiet gratitude for how something so small, an insect, a flower, a warm afternoon, could create something that lasts. The beekeeper wrapped the wax in paper, the rustle soft and slow, and explained that wax is a kind of structure made visible. The bees secrete it from their own bodies, shaping it into a geometry that holds food, holds young, holds the future. The guest thought about that, how a living community builds a home out of itself, and felt the idea settle into them like a calm truth. There are ways to build that do not require force, only steadiness and care. As the day leaned toward evening, the field beyond the apiary began to change sound. The birds quieted, and the insects took over. The bees were still active, yet their flight seemed to soften, as if the colony were gradually shifting into a different gear for the later hours. The hum remained, but it felt slightly deeper, like a song sung closer to the chest. The guest imagined the bees inside the hives, fanning their wings to regulate temperature, moving nectar, tending brood, each small action part of a larger balance. The beekeeper extinguished the smoker by closing its lid, and the last thread of smoke faded into the warm air. He cleaned the hive tool with a simple motion, wiping away propolis, keeping the metal ready for next time. The guest appreciated these small closures. Ending well, like beginning well, was part of the calm. Nothing was thrown down, nothing was left chaotic. The tools were cared for because the work was cared for. They stood together at the gate again, the same threshold where the guest had arrived, and looked back at the hives. In the golden light, the boxes seemed almost sleepy, though the life inside remained awake and purposeful. Bees continued to pass through the entrances in gentle lines, and the guest could now see those lines as something comforting, a proof that the world can be busy without being harsh. The field beyond swayed, and the breeze moved like a slow hand over the tops of grasses. The beekeeper spoke a few final words, nothing dramatic, just a quiet reminder that a hive is not a machine in the cold sense, but it does work with the reliability of a well-made mechanism. It is made of living parts, each responsive, each capable of adjustment, each contributing to the whole. guest thought about their own day, about the thoughts that had spun too fast, and felt them slow as if they had been gently set in place. A harmonious mechanism does not grind. It turns smoothly because its parts are aligned. As they began to leave, the guest looked once more at the bees in flight. The air around the apiary seemed filled with tiny paths, invisible routes between flowers and home, between sunlight and stored sweetness. Every bee was small, yet together they made something vast. A steady presence, a living warmth, an architecture of wax and intention. The guest felt the same kind of comfort one feels when hearing a familiar song from another room, something dependable, something that continues whether or not you watch it. The path back seemed shorter than the path in. The guest's body felt pleasantly heavy, as though it had absorbed the warmth of the day and decided to keep it. The veil came off, and the air on the face felt cool and gentle, carrying the lingering scent of honey and smoke and sun-warmed plants. Behind them, the hum softened with distance, becoming a faint undertone rather than a clear sound. But it stayed in the mind like a lullaby that doesn't end when the music stops. At the edge of the field, the guest paused and listened one last time. The bees were now mostly a quiet background, and in their place, the evening insects began their steady chorus. The sky had that late summer clarity, a pale blue that would soon deepen, and the first hint of cooler air touched the day's warmth without extinguishing it. The guest felt the kind of peace that comes not from escaping the world, but from seeing how gently it can run when you approach it with respect. Walking onward, the guest carried the apiary's rhythm inside them. The slow lifting of frames, the careful spacing, the soft return of wood to wood, the steady hum like breath, all of it became a pattern the mind could follow. Each step felt like another small part of the same harmony. Foot meets ground, breath meets air, day meets evening. And in that quiet continuity, it became easy to imagine sleep not as a sudden drop, but as a gradual settling, like a hive closing for the night, while warmth and life remain safely within. By the time the guest reached home, the world felt softer around the edges. The sounds of ordinary life were present, distant traffic, a door closing somewhere, the subtle creak of a house cooling as the sun lowered, but none of them felt sharp. The guest washed their hands and noticed the faint sweetness that lingered on their skin, as if the honey's warmth had left a trace. In the mirror, their face looked calmer, the eyes less hurried, the mouth resting naturally. As they prepared for bed, the guest remembered the bees again, not as a swarm, not as something to fear, but as a steady community doing what it has always done. The mind returned to the image of comb, hexagons repeating, each one fitting perfectly beside the next, strong because of its shared edges. Thoughts, too, could be placed like that, not piled in a messy heap, but arranged gently, given their space, allowed to rest. The guest let the day's concerns become small cells, each one closed for now, each one safe to return to tomorrow. In the quiet darkness, the guest imagined the apiary in the moonlight. The hives stood still, their lids cool now, their sides holding the steady warmth created by many bodies inside. Bees clustered, moved, fanned, tended soft work, continuing without fuss. Outside, the field slept in layers of shadow, and the breeze moved slowly as if it, too, had learned the value of gentleness. The whole world felt like a calm mechanism, not rigid, but balanced, turning smoothly through night toward another morning. Breathing in, the guest recalled the scent of wax, clean, golden, patient. Breathing out, they recalled the hum, a soft background that asked nothing and gave steadiness. The images came and went without demand, sunlight on hive roofs, bees returning with pollen, the beekeeper's quiet hands guiding frames back into place. The guest let those images drift like slow boats across a still lake, watching them without needing to follow. Sleep approached the way evening approached the apiary, gradually, naturally, with no sudden command. The body softened into the bed, and the mind released its grip on lists and tasks. Somewhere deep in memory, the honeyed light lingered, and the gentle hum continued not as noise, but as reassurance. And in that reassurance, the guest slipped into rest, as peacefully as a hive settling into night, with warmth held safely inside and the world turning smoothly on.